Who is Rigoberta Menchú Tum? It is not a name you hear in many history books. Born in a small village in Guatemala, Menchú grew up during a time of war and hardship. As a young woman, she risked her life speaking up for the indigenous people of Guatemala. These people were the descendants of the ancient Maya, people who had lived on the land for thousands of years. This is the story of Rigoberta Menchú Tum, the woman who dared to speak up.
Hi, young historians. It's time for another episode of Anytime Now. I'm Brooke, co-founder of Honest History. In this episode, we're exploring the story of someone not mentioned much in history books. Yet, her accomplishments changed the lives of so many people for the better. She even won a Nobel Peace Prize for her incredible work. As you listen to this episode, think about someone or a group of people that you truly care about. Now, imagine those people were in trouble. Would you risk everything to speak up and tell the world about what was happening? That's what Rigoberta did. Even though she knew there was a big chance that she would be punished for speaking up, she still spoke up to help the people she loved. Now, let's head to Guatemala for this inspiring story.
Our story begins in the early 1960s. A young Rigoberta Menchú Tum sat by the fire. The wood crackled loudly as the light from the flames lit up the other children's faces. Her grandfather was sitting across from her. She could see his white eyebrows and wrinkled face in the glow of the flames. He was about to tell a story. Do you know why rabbits have cotton ball tails instead of long tails? He asked the children. Well, long ago, he began, when the world was bright and shiny and everything was new, there lived two boys. These boys were sent by their grandparents to protect the cornfields on Earth. Every night, animals would come and eat all the corn. So someone had to keep watch over the fields. Menchú's grandfather explained how the boys fell asleep and the animals ate all the corn. The boys told their grandparents what had happened, and their grandparents gave them another chance. The next night, the boys didn't fall asleep. They scared away all the animals. A rabbit ran off, and one of the boys grabbed it by the tail. Back then, her grandfather said, rabbits had large, fluffy tails, almost as big as the tails on baby horses. When the boy grabbed the tail, part of it broke off in his hand. And that is why rabbits have little cotton balls instead of tails, Menchú's grandfather said. Her grandfather liked to tell these old stories around the fire. They were the stories of the ancient Maya, Rigoberta Menchú's ancestors. Thousands of years ago, the ancient Maya had built a powerful civilization. They were the observers of the sky. They created a calendar that followed the movement of the moon, planets, and stars. They built great cities with stone pyramids and grew many crops. After the year 900, the Maya left many of the ancient cities. Historians are still not sure exactly why this happened. In the 16th century, the Spanish had conquered the land. When they arrived, they brought diseases that killed many Maya. During the next centuries, the Maya suffered under the Spanish rule. They were used for hard labor and struggled to survive. Yet during this difficult time, they kept their ancient traditions alive. They saved their languages and held on to their deep connection with the land. Today, over 6 million Maya live in Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. The Maya are a diverse group of people with over 20 different languages. Rigoberta Menchú and her family spoke the Mayan language of Kaish. They lived in a village called Chimel near the mountains of Guatemala. Guatemala is a country in Central America, just below Mexico. Although it is small, the country is filled with so many different animals and plants. In its jungles, you can find jaguars, parrots, and howler monkeys. Off the coast, you can find sea turtles and lobsters. In the swamps, there are sneaky crocodiles. And up in the hills where Rigoberta Menchú lived, there's a beautiful quetzal with its long green tail. Her ancestors believed that this bird was the living form of the god Quetzalcoatl. Menchú's village was in the highlands, where the soil is rich for growing crops. There you can find coffee, banana, and cocoa plants. Her mother used the many herbs and plants all around them as medicine. When Menchú was young, the plants healed her cuts and scrapes. The Menchú family lived in a wooden house with a straw roof. Near their home, there were green fields of corns and a river where people bathed and women washed clothes. The corn was used to make tortillas, which Menchú's family ate with black beans and guacamole. Corn, also known as maíz, is very important to the Maya. The ancient Maya believed that humans were made from a mixture of yellow and white corn. Menchú had been taught to respect the maíz and the land around her. "We must only harm the earth when we are in need," Menchú said. "This is why, before we sow our maíz, we have to ask the earth's permission." Life in the village was not always easy, but Menchú loved the time she spent there as a child. Most people could not live in the village all year. For many months, family moved to the coast to work in the fields or plantations called fincas. Even children would work in the fields picking coffee beans and cotton. In the early morning, before the sun rose, Menchú would walk through the thick forest to the fields. In the darkness, it was hard to see, but she could hear the animals all around her. It would be cold as she walked barefoot over the vines. The dark palm leaves hung over her head. She would reach the field as the sun began to rise in the sky. The farm workers had just begun their long day of work picking coffee beans. Life on the finca was very hard. Many people did not have enough to eat. Sometimes they would get sick from the pesticides that were sprayed on the fields to protect the plants from the bugs. Hundreds of people were crammed into one-room buildings. That's what life was like on the coast. Just one house to hold 400 or 500 people, Menchú said. Menchú saw many people die, including her family members and closest friends. "What will it be like when I'm older?" she asked. She saw how her people suffered and wanted things to change. When Menchú was growing up, Guatemala was a very troubled country. It was divided into two groups of people, the indigenous and the Maya. The indigenous are descendants of the Spanish. The Maya are the indigenous people of Guatemala. The farmland that the Maya worked on was owned by a small number of people. Powerful families and companies grew wealthy while poor indigenous and Maya struggled. Some Maya protested the government, including Menchú and her family.
Always was, always will be. Aboriginal land.
They asked for land and a better life for their people. At this time, Guatemala was in the middle of a civil war. This was a war the United States helped create. During the war, many people in the country rose up against the government. The Guatemalan government began attacking anyone who might be against them. This included journalists, students, priests, nuns, and indigenous people. Soldiers began attacking entire villages. People were captured, homes burned, crops destroyed, and many died. During this horrible time, Menchú managed to escape, but her family did not survive. Guatemala was not safe. At the age of 22, she got on a plane to leave her home and flew to Mexico. Outside Guatemala, Menchú felt like it was safer to speak up. She spoke to organizations about the Guatemalan government and the suffering of her people. At this time, not many people knew Menchú's name, but this was about to change. A year later, in 1982, she was invited to Europe to talk about the violence in Guatemala. An anthropologist named Elizabeth Burgos wanted to write a book about Menchú's life. She asked to interview Menchú while she was in Europe. The two women met in Paris, France, one January evening. It was a very cold night when Menchú arrived at Burgos' home. As Burgos opened her front door, she saw that Menchú did not have a coat or stockings. Instead, she was dressed in the clothing of her ancestors. Her blouse, called a huipil, was embroidered with colorful patterns. Her skirt, called a corte, went down to her ankles. Around her waist, she wore a brightly colored sash. In her culture, it is important to wear this traditional clothing. Anyone who doesn't dress as our grandfathers, our ancestors dressed, is on the road to ruin, she said. For a week, Menchú came to Burgos' home every day to talk. They spoke for hours. By the end of the week, Burgos had recorded 25 hours of conversation on tape. Using the recordings, Burgos wrote down and edited Menchú's words into a book. The book is called I, Rigoberta Menchú. This now famous book began with the words, "My name is Rigoberta Menchú. I am 23 years old. This is my testimony. I didn't learn it from a book, and I didn't learn it alone." I'd like to stress that it's not only my life, it's also the testimony of my people. My story is the story of all poor Guatemalans. My personal experience is the reality of a whole people. After the book was published, more and more people learned about the situation in Guatemala. Menchú realized that her words could not only help her people, but all indigenous people around the world who suffered. In 1992, at the age of 33, Menchú received news that would change her life. She was back in Guatemala inside a Catholic church. She always had to be careful when she was back home. The government did not like that she spoke up against them. A priest let her hide in his office and stay there for the night. A few hours after she fell asleep, a telephone rang. She answered the phone and heard a man's voice. He said he was the Norwegian ambassador of Mexico. Menchú had no idea why he was calling.
In 9 minutes, it will be announced that you have won the Nobel Peace Prize. Let me be the first to congratulate you.
Menchú was shocked. The Norwegian ambassador told her that it was his job to give her the news. The Peace Prize was always awarded by a Norwegian committee. They wanted to give her the award for all the work she had done for the indigenous people. Menchú only had a few minutes to prepare. Once the news was out, she would have to give a press conference. Still in shock, Menchú spoke to the press a few minutes later. "How I would love to have all my family alive and here with me," she told the press. "Because life is peace. I desire life and peace." Menchú knew how important the Nobel Peace Prize was for her work. "I consider this prize not as an award to me personally, she said, but rather as one for human rights and for the rights of the indigenous people. Menchú used the money from the prize to start a foundation to help Native people and protect human rights around the world. 4 years later, in 1996, the civil war in Guatemala finally ended. The war had lasted 36 years. Over 200,000 people had died. More than 80% of these people were Maya. Thousands of people disappeared. Even today, many Mayas still don't know what happened to their loved ones. A few years later, scholars began questioning some of the facts in the book, I, Rigoberta Menchú. To this day, Menchú states that the book is not her story, but the story of all indigenous Guatemalans. It includes events she saw and the stories she heard from others. During the war, Menchú risked her life to speak up against the government. For many years, she was the only voice for the Maya people. In recent years, more Maya have begun talking about what happened in Guatemala. They feel they can finally tell their story. So, who is Rigoberta Menchú Tum? Young historians, you now know the answer to this question.
Welcome back. That was a truly incredible story of perseverance and bravery. Nobody made Rigoberta speak up for her people and write down her testimony. Yet, she still did the right thing knowing that it would be a great sacrifice for her and her family. Rigoberta isn't alone in her bravery. Many people in history spoke up in the face of adversity for what they believed in. In fact, someone listening to this very episode may grow up and win a Nobel Peace Prize themselves. But even if you don't end up writing a book like Rigoberta, always remember her inspiring story and the way she stood up for what she believed in. That's all for now. But if you want to learn more about the inspiring stories of other amazing Indigenous peoples, be sure to check out issue 15 of Honest History magazine, A Native Story. You can learn all about Native American history as told by Native Americans. See you all next time. This episode was hosted by Julia Corral and written by Heidi Coburn. Production was led by Randall Lawrence. To learn more about this episode, including more about the host, visit us at honesthistorymag.com and follow along for updates on social media at Honest History.